Critical, we thought, was using sound sources, balanced opinion, and analysing.
Balanced opinion, that's interesting. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Well, not just taking one source and, because somebody said something's right, if you happen to agree with that, then not to include somebody that's contradicting it.
So drawing out the counter arguments as well as the supporting arguments. And how would you deal with, because you don't want to dilute your own opinion, am I right? So how would you present a counter argument in a useful way, do you think? Without saying, like, I think this, but these guys think I'm wrong. Thus, I might be wrong. See what I mean?
I find it really hard, this critical thing, because in the literature review, you're kind of sort of saying, Jones says this, but Smith says that, and I feel that you can't really bring your own opinion into the literature review because you're just bringing what other people have written about it. So I find this critical thing difficult, because how can I be critical when I'm bringing to the table what other people have said about it?
Yeah, and that is one of the most difficult things about writing literature review, actually. It's very hard not to fall into simply listing your sources as opposed to bringing them together. Part of critical writing with the literature review, particularly, is synthesizing. And we have that slide back there about the process of critical thinking, right? Analysis, synthesis, evaluating. Simply synthesizing sources into a kind of larger argument is an act of critical writing. To bring 4 or 5 articles together and say, well, actually, the body of the research finds these 3 key things. It's everywhere, regardless of methodology. That's a critical writing moment, even though it is still just reporting on what's there. See what I mean? So it's not always critical thinking and critical writing. It isn't always about criticism. It's not always about taking things apart. It's very much about seeing how they already fit together as well. So I hope that helps a bit. In terms of the discussion of your dissertation, this is where you get the opportunity to step into that context with your own opinion. And that's quite a bit more difficult, isn't it? So let's keep going with this, because we've got some good stuff. So this is where you analyze, yeah? This is where you present the arguments and the counter arguments, where you draw out your sources. What other things have we come up? What do you have for descriptive?
We've just got telling a story.
Telling a story, interesting. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
It just turned very superficial, like you're just kind of not really listing facts even, you just...
Because I always use the word story to think about something more involved. But actually, the other way around, if you're just talking about something on a superficial level, right? Just kind of rattling it off.
Yeah,
without
with
digging
no
in.
sound knowledge of what you're trying to say. Like it's not backed by anything.
Aha. Lack of evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because I think there can be evidence in descriptive writing, yeah? But there can't be, it's like a non-feature of critical writing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So that might be a misnomer putting it in that column, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What have we got over here? Descriptive writing versus critical writing.
So we've got similar things actually, but saying sort of descriptive is giving the facts, whereas critical is kind of reviewing facts.
Oh, I like that.
Kind of lack of evidence could kind of be better said that way.
So let's just tie these two together. Pretty well the same thing, yeah? That's what my smiling face means. Giving the facts versus reviewing the facts. So what might be involved in a process of reviewing?
So you're looking, you've read a wide scope of information and you're just looking at key points of each one and comparing, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And I've just pulled out that word, and I'm sure it wasn't actually what you meant me to pull out of that, but I did anyway. Key points. This is key. One of the features of descriptive writing versus critical, also just one of the features of not great writing versus, great writing, great research, is being selective. You need to draw out the key points, the significant bits, the interesting bits, the bits that have impact, rather than telling us everything. So that's part of that critical process, right? Is trying to decide what's important, as opposed to simply putting it all down, yeah? This is what I came up with, but I didn't come up with this. Stella Cottrell came up with this, who wrote a handy little study guide, study skills handbook thing. So descriptive writing states what happened, right? Which is kind of what we got here, giving the facts, versus critical writing, which identifies the significance of what happened, right? Descriptive writing will tell you what something is like. It'll simply say, this happened, this is how it played out, as opposed to critical writing, which will evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of an argument or of a study or whatever, right? So dig deeper, like you're talking about. Descriptive writing explains how something works, as opposed to critical writing, which indicates why something will work best. So it's not just a question of taking apart a process or a methodology or whatever and describing it. I gave out questionnaires. Everyone answered the questionnaires. This is what the questionnaires tell us. That's explaining how something works. Whereas drawing out why something would work well, which is something that you do need to do in your discussion and in your methodology section, actually, but also in your discussion. Why is your methodology suitable to answer the questions that you want to answer, yeah? Descriptive writing notes the method used. I used questionnaires. Versus critical, which will identify whether that's appropriate. So pretty much the exact same thing I just said, yeah. It lists details, descriptive writing, so we've already got that, giving the facts, versus evaluating the relative significance of details. So this is being selective, drawing out the important bits, yeah? And descriptive writing gives information, whereas critical writing draws conclusions. So at the very simplest level, this is the difference between really drawing out your own evaluation and opinion of these things versus simply presenting what you found. Does that make sense? Do you guys have questions about this so far? No? We'll put it into practice a little bit and see how it goes in just a moment. So critical analysis is going to have phrases like these, which you've probably all used and you've definitely all read, right? The results further showed the relevance of. However, there may have been, this is where you're drawing in counter arguments, another possible explanation for the difference in findings. So this is where you're comparing and contrasting. Another consideration might be, so this is all about using the right language to show the relationships between your findings and your research and drawing out the significance of them. These are the kinds of things that you see in academic writing all the time, right? It's very hard to actually do, though. I'll give you a little hint. Signposts like this, accordingly, however, despite this, similarly, all of these words that show relationships between facts that demonstrate the critical process of comparing things and drawing them out, you can find on this handy little website called the Academic Phrase Bank. Has anybody seen it? No? Yay! I'm about to show you something amazing. Academic Phrase Bank. If you Google it, it'll just come up, but they've got this handy little URL, which is just academicphrasebank.ac.uk. It has lists upon lists of academic phrases and words and explains to you which ones you need to use to show which kinds of relationships and to demonstrate which kinds of arguments. It is a lifesaver. It can really help you when you're stuck on, coming back to where to start. How do I bring all these things together? using a structure like that built on, standard academic phrases, it's not that exciting, but it's very useful, at least in terms of getting you thinking, right? Even throwing in a word like however can get you thinking about, well, what are the counter arguments, right? What do I need to talk about here? Does that make sense? Yeah? So check it out, academic phrasing. You're gonna love it. Making the links. So this is coming back to what we already know is that the discussion should link the findings with your aims and your objectives, right? So you always want to have in your mind how your findings affect your hypothesis or your research question. So when you start writing your discussion, it can be very handy to break it down into a little table like we've got here. You might adapt this a little bit for your own practice, but the basics should remain the same. You always want to keep in mind what your research question is and how each finding relates to your research question. So I'm going to just use some research I've been doing because we're all doing different things and we're not all done our research, am I right? So I'll use my stuff as an example. I'm doing some research on teen reading habits. One of the questions is teen literacy up to appropriate levels? One of the findings that came out of a recent study, not our own, but a recent one I was reading, is that the average difficulty level of students reading plateaus around year 6. So I'm looking at all these questionnaires and I can see that this reading level plateaus at year 6. I know I've got this question about teen literacy and whether it's at the right levels. So I've got a finding, I've got a question, I know they relate. I need to think now about how they relate. And this is a very helpful way to, as I said, begin your discussion, right? To list each of your questions and then in the side column or a side column beside it, list each of your significant findings and then think about what the relationships are between those things. So you might start with a little bit of a sketch, an outline of how all of your findings relate to your research question, and that will give you the material for writing the discussion, right? You also want to think, well, have my questions been answered, right? And did I get the answers that I expected? When I was doing my PhD thesis, I did not come up with what I thought I was going to come up with, and it was terrifying. But it ended up working out really well, because I think it was a better piece of work in the end. But at first I was like, oh my God, I need to rewrite the whole thing. It didn't turn out right. You don't need to rewrite the whole thing if it doesn't turn out how you expected. What you then need to do is think about, well, why didn't it turn out the way I expected? How did it turn out, and what does that mean? So it requires a bit of a paradigm shift, but that can be good. That's where good work comes in, right? So don't be afraid if all the answers are not what you expected. Making the links. So you've got a finding. I've got this finding that the average difficulty level that books that students are reading kind of plateaus around year 6, and that's year 6 of school. So when I'm thinking about findings, and this can be another good way of drawing out what it is that you want to talk about in the discussion, looking at each individual finding and developing it. So here I've got this finding. The next thing I want to do with it is think about previous work. How does this relate to the research that I've already done? So in this example, see, I've got the description, the finding, yeah. Previous work, well, this is pretty consistent with all of the other research that I've done. Every other study that's been done about this has found this sort of plateau and found that teens don't read very much afterwards. And I've got a kind of list of sources there to back that up, yeah. Then I want to think about, well, why? Why does this happen? Why did I find this? And this is where I start drawing in my own opinion, right? And I'm going to draw some of this based on previous research, and a little bit of it on instinct, but I'll need to back that up with research as well. So it suggests that kids aren't really challenging themselves in their reading choices, I would say, or that they're making choices based on popular culture rather than their actual level at school. So maybe kids are reading The Hunger Games not because they're not literate, but because it's in the movies and it's fun, right? So I can't necessarily draw conclusions. There might be other reasons. And these are things that I've drawn out of other research. And I've got my sources there to say, well, other people have studied this and they've thought that these might also be factors. There's practical issues with the methodology of this study that I've been reading, and the researchers said that mostly the measure they were using was actually just being used as an intervention strategy in schools. So you're kind of getting results from struggling readers, not all readers. So that might be a problem too, right? So this is all about questioning the reliability of this finding, but also questioning the why. Why did I find this? It's not because they don't know how to read, right? There might be other things happening. So you start digging around. Why did this happen? Analysis, yeah? And then you've got to take it even further. So I can say, well, this happened. These might be the reasons why, but who cares? So what? What's the big deal? And that's your next question. So what? What are the implications of this? Well, at face value, this suggests that teen literacy might be an issue. And you know, for educators, that's an issue. Maybe we need to think about the structure of secondary education, perhaps. Maybe teens aren't reaching appropriate reading levels for their age group. That's a significant so what, right? So I need to draw out those implications if this finding is reliable. And the what next? So this is where you say, well, I've sort of realized there might be inconsistencies here, there might be issues, but this might also be significant. What do we do with that? What would future research look like? I'm obviously not going to solve the problem that might have come out of this finding, but I've drawn a problem out of the finding, and I'm going to propose, well, this is what we might do with this. What next? So the validity of this needs to be determined, whether or not this is reliable, right? As I mentioned. And further research needs to be conducted about, say, motivation and purpose for reading. You know, are they reading series books because they can't read anything more? Or are they reading them because they want to, because it's fun? Are they reading them because they're in the movies and that's what everybody's talking about? You know, what's going on here? So does this make sense, this process? Yeah. So this is where you evaluate, right, in those last questions, the so what and the what next. So I would suggest that while you're starting to figure out what your discussion is actually going to be about, what you're going to draw out of your findings, to list your findings in this way, your main findings, right? And then to answer these questions. How does this finding relate to previous work? Why might this have happened? So what? What are the implications of this? And what next? What can future researchers, maybe even me, do to take this a bit further? Yeah? And that gives you probably several paragraphs of pretty demonstrable critical thinking and writing, right? You've already written it down in the columns. You've got the words, you've got the language to talk about it. So this gives you an outline for what you're going to write your discussion bits about. So why don't we give it a try? Yay! All right, so since we're not already all done our research, I printed out these things about this teen reading thing that I've been doing. And what we've got here are two tables. So it's a book, I'm so sorry. It's a table summarizing what or how much students are reading and what difficulty levels it's at. And on the other side, you've got for years 9 to 11, what books they're reading. So this is all based, just for a little bit of context, it'll say quizzes taken. How they've measured this is they've done quizzes online at school about books they've read, and this is where the software is evaluating their reading level and all that. So quizzes taken equals books read, essentially, is what I'm trying to tell you. Yeah? So what I want you to do, and why don't we do this in pairs? I think that'll work best, yeah? So if you want to get into pairs, and I want you to choose 2 findings from these tables, whatever you like, just 2 facts that turn up in these tables. And I want you to go through this process with those 2 findings. So probably you're not going to have any previous research to draw on, am I right? So let's just skip that bit. But I want you to think about why, so what, and what next. Feel free to make totally outrageous conclusions about what you think about what this means. That's fine, because I know you don't have the research context. This is more just about practicing the process of asking these questions about your findings. Sound good? So in pairs, 2 findings, the why, the so what, and the what next. So this is all about deciding how you actually discuss your findings. All right, go forth and have some fun with it.